We all have unspoken needs, particularly a need to deal with trauma that we don't allow ourselves to deal with. But how can we deal with trauma that we subconsciously hide away because it doesn't fit into our narratives? Trauma that we don't allow ourselves to feel for one reason or another. Maybe it's the fear of social rejection, or just us believing that it could never be solved. What we need is someone, somewhere, or something to tell us what we're going through, to help us make sense of the seemingly impossible and teach us how to solve problems that overwhelm us deep down. And I believe that is the point of the late half of Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker story, where it revolves around the ancients and Medion, and through our journey as a warrior of light, we also learn how to walk down the metaphorical path in real life. For most of my life, I've been struggling with anxiety and depression since I was little. Although I never had a proper diagnosis until I was 13, it was evident early on. One of my first encounters with anxious thoughts were, what if my mom got into a car accident on her way home after dropping me off at kindergarten? And for a moment, it felt so real. The images flooded into my mind and made me cry, knowing I wouldn't be able to handle the pain if it became a reality. The teachers, however, were very angry with me, thought I wouldn't shut up as I was disrupting the class. They shamed me and told me to stand outside the room as everyone stared, probably in curiosity. And in their defense, when running a class of small children, one sobbing and interrupting the flow of things is a huge nuisance to everyone around. At the time, however, it was hard for me to understand that expressing my feelings was a disruptance. And while it may be difficult to explain to a young child why it's wrong to be disruptive, I don't think it was right to silence them by using forceful punishments. Rather than simply learning it was bad to cry in the middle of class, it also taught me that these feelings themselves were wrong. As a result, I internalized them and learned that I had to push down these emotions as much as possible. Ideally, I would have wished they asked me why I was crying and taught me how to accept these feelings instead of just teaching me to go with the flow. When I was 13, I long stopped randomly crying in inappropriate situations. They have, instead, manifested in the form of panic attacks. I regularly had panic attacks in class or other events, where it began with some kind of physical sensation accompanied by a thought, like my chest tightening up and the feeling of being trapped in a public place where it was quote-unquote unsafe to display emotions. I sat down in class with a pounding heart, feeling everything close in on me as I helplessly watched the minutes pass like it would never end until my panic attacks eventually slowly faded away. Despite panic attacks always being temporary, however, it never feels that way. It always feels like they're getting worse, and when you have a panic attack, it's already difficult to speak. So when I gave it my all, to beg them to give me permission to let me leave the stressful environment, and they denied that despite being aware of my diagnosis, not only did I have to deal with the panic attack itself, but I also now felt like a horrible person for disrupting the class with my loud hyperventilating and weird movements, like very visible shaking and gripping my wrist with the other hand. And of course, it made me feel like an outcast. And I'm sure it's not a surprise that middle school children are not very understanding and quite judgmental because it was behavior they've likely never encountered before. Panic attacks, unlike the urge to cry, feel entirely impossible to ignore. They were my brain begging for problems to be addressed and questions to be answered. And to make things worse, my biggest flaw is that I've always been someone who has needed emotional validation, someone constantly filled with doubt and the fear to cause harm to people from thinking that I knew better. and that made me too afraid to be confident about anything positive that I might have believed in myself. This leaves me as a very indecisive person, someone who doesn't have the resolve without being clearly reminded that I'm not in the wrong. But ironically, the people I sought validation in were perhaps the most clueless about mental health and only had a false sense of certainty by knowing so little that they couldn't tell they were wrong at all, something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. But in my helpless state, I didn't want to believe that they were wrong, because I wanted to believe someone had the answer to my questions, even if I was a villain for having asked questions that never should have existed in their eyes. So how does all this tie in with Endwalker? Personally, there's just so much for me to talk about in Endwalker that I won't be able to cover most of it. But in this video, I want to address the Ancients and Medians specifically, and the MSQ from level 87 to 90, covering the story of you traveling back in time to visit Elpis and learning about the Unsundered World. An overview of the story starts with you traveling to Elpis after you killed Zodiac, and the final days began to unfold as a result. With a heavy heart, you arrive at the Unsundered World in Elpis as a fragmented being to find the answers as to why the final days are unfolding in your own time. The world seems beautiful at a first glance. Everyone there has creation magic to create anything they want, immortality until they choose otherwise, and life filled with meaning to contribute to the star with their unique talent. No one is known by their identity, however, only their duty and role in the star. And that's when I started questioning at the back of my mind whether or not it's really a paradise. In the world of the ancients, they are ever trying to make new discoveries and new creations to better our theories. Yet, there is no individualism in that. Sure, you could argue that the roles are individual, but rarely is one role ever definitive of a whole person. The story of every person is never just what they contribute to the world, and same goes for every ancient. Yet, the game makes it blatantly obvious that there is no individualism beyond their roles, and most ancients choose to end their life after finishing their duty. Despite having the immortality to experience everything there could be to experience, almost nobody chooses it. It is so much easier to let someone else or society collectively decide for us who we are, or choose an aspect about us and say that is what we are. It fills us with a sense of certainty and meaning to pursue life, and a false sense of safety from suffering. Yet, behind the facade, there is constant lingering dull pain, the feeling that something is not quite right, a crack in the seemingly perfect idea. And one day, someone inevitably comes to question it and gets dismissed, that someone in the Unsundered World being Hermes. Hermes was susceptible to emotions that most didn't have, like how I was condemned to the terrifying yet unlikely possibilities that flooded my mind. He was cursed to see the suffering of mankind's living creatures being at the mercy of his own kind. In the same way, he hesitates in taking the role of Van Daniel because he knows that it would mean ending the life of the previous Van Daniel. This shows that he is someone with a different view, willing to question what was collectively decided to be meaningful and what is not. And because his problems and questions were dismissed, he created Medion, an entelechy, a being capable of perceiving what others think and feel, and wielding the force of dynamis that represents emotion in our own world. In her quest to fulfill Hermes' wish, she and her sisters go off into the universe to find out why other beings choose to live. However, the stars that once had lives all ended one way or another in tragedy, either by sickness, warfare, or even just the lack of meaning. Believing it would protect mankind, Medion decides to end humanity before they had to suffer a painful death. When you, Emet-Selch, but not Hythlodaeus, and Hermes himself find out, Hermes surprises everyone by letting Medion try, arguing it is a test to humanity's worth, like they did to all the beings he deleted out of existence because they weren't worthy in humanity's eyes. And so, the final days of the unsundered world began. Using Dynamis, Medion becomes Endsinger and warps the creation magic of the ancients to create horrid creatures that destroyed their once paradise. As the warrior of light, this is where we learn the nature of the final days in our own time and go back to our current timeline to try and stop it. As we go back, we also learn why Venat sundered the world. As the world was being destroyed, the ancients felt a great pain they've never felt before, overcome by the losses of their loved ones and home, and everything both physically and metaphorically was brought down in that instant. In that one moment, all the cracks in reality they sought to ignore for so long have been bursted open at last, and a grand narrative that was once believed to be their reality shattered before them. The skies lit aflame, and the land cracked and torn. And so came Zodiac, at the cost of half of the population, here to stabilize the world together and prevent Endsinger from influencing their creation magic anymore. But instead of accepting this solution as temporary, and that they must take on Endsinger to truly prevent the inevitable second coming of the final days, the ancients collectively decided that, at whatever cost, to get back the paradise that was there before. But not another ancient who saw this, and the only ancient retired of her role and did not end her life, made the painful decision to sunder the world. As perfect beings, the ancients could not affect the forces of Dynamis. To me, I believe this symbolizes how they have perfectly convinced themselves of the lie of the unsundered world being a paradise, a state that we all seem to be encouraged to strive for in the real world, that if we manage to do it, we think we would reach this paradise. But this paradise is not a real paradise, as it simply involves us ignoring all the cracks that are there and suppressing them. But no matter how powerful, these cracks cannot be sealed simply by being ignored. We must peer into them and accept whatever lies behind. For the cracks are the cracks of a wall we've made to hide away all that which interrupts the narrative we want to believe in life. So as Venat sunders the world, no more did humanity have the power to create whatever they want, both in lies and in physical objects that would let them create a temporary world to hide from the inevitable. This scene resonated with me so much. For the first time in life, I felt understood and right for once. Despite everything I was told, maybe I wasn't a villain for simply having these questions. Because, while I questioned the world like Hermes, I did not choose to deal with it by imposing my own ideals of worth onto other people or beings. Hermes' actions were extreme, of course, literally willing to put humanity to the test of what he deemed worthy by destroying the wall in a forceful way when nobody was capable of tolerating it yet. And it makes sense. In the real world, when being told over and over that a paradise is what we need and want to go for, to be convinced to live behind that wall and strive to build it, we don't want to believe the harm we cause and might yet cause unto ourselves and others, unless we destroy our own vision of paradise first. Good thing we aren't quote-unquote perfect beings, as we still have yet to fully convince ourselves of these delusions. That's why we still suffer the symptoms of anxiety and depression rather than a temporary state of complete numbness in this sudden and complete destruction. As such, I said we only need our vision of paradise destroyed and not our paradise itself, because we don't have the capabilities to create one. The extreme actions and consequences of Hermes and refusal from the ancients to question their fundamental beliefs lay out to us a comprehensible possibility of where we're heading should we ever be able to achieve that state of perceived paradise. But unlike Hermes, we don't have to go that route either. We can retain our abilities to question if we accept suffering as a constant part of life, and in doing so, we prevent our own final days, whether it is a personal one in whatever ways we define it, or a literal one, such as destroying humanity with a war. After the knot sunders the world, we are off on our journey to defeat Endsinger, a fight full of emotions and reminding each other of our capabilities to fight back against the need for nihilism to cope. And I believe that is the point of Endwalker. We aren't supposed to feel okay. We may not have the creation magic that can create anything to bear us the temporary paradise, but we, in the in-game world and in real life, bear the ability to create meaning. And I believe that is our ability to influence dynamics. And seeing that, as much as I hated myself and felt hated in a world where I've been told there is no space for my emotions or else I am a nuisance, I realize there is more in the world than the narrative that we sought to go after. In accepting what we don't know, in accepting the suffering from loss and failure, we learn how to deal with it. Because how can we answer a question when we ask for the impossible to protect a false narrative that was doomed from the beginning? Endwalker is coming to an end, and as much as it makes me sad, I will never forget the impact it had on my internal world, a world that interacts and intertwines with the external world. I appreciate my ability to wield dynamis, however, because while ideally we don't need to be validated for how we feel, we, as humans, are imperfect and do need to be reminded of our capabilities sometimes. And I believe we don't need creation magic or a paradise in the fictional world or in our real world. Instead, we need meaning, because even if we could have everything we think we want in a world that could bear us to paradise, creation magic cannot create meaning. It's okay to be lost, it's okay to be scared, to not know, and we all have been invalidated in the past because we have disrupted the grand narrative in one way or another. But we are still here, capable of validating it for ourselves and others. And as much as the suffering was unjustified, that we shouldn't have to deal with it, we can not only tolerate it, but also create something much more beautiful than creation magic ever could. And knowing that, we learn to reclaim our power to question and create meaning, to tolerate suffering and accepting that it isn't inherently bad. As MSL says, Hermes' question was flawed, because in asking, why do other beings live, there's a presumption that there is even a why for them. And in asking a flawed question, Gideon found a flawed answer, because the answer isn't lying anywhere else for you to find. It lies here, right here, in those theories and in the real world, for you to create. Isn't that so much more beautiful, knowing it is in our power and not in the hands of someone else?